Let's talk to Colonel Simon Diggins. He was the former British Defence Attaché in Kabul and joins us now. Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
Julia, good morning to you.
Where do we even start? We've gone through again and again for people to explain. As much as we can understand, because so many different numbers in terms of the number of Afghans involved, and indeed the huge cost to the British government, and who knew what when. Lots of different versions of events. But what do you make of this whole affair? Which is the worst bit of it, and can you justify any of it?
Very hard to know where the worst bit of it is. It's like a sort of onion, isn't it? You peel one layer away, then something else appears from behind it, whether it be the cost of it, whether it be the extent of the superinjunction, all the way through to the actual numbers themselves. I think you have to take right way back to what happened between 2014 and 2021. After 2014, we stopped combat operations, and we got into this phase where we were conducting a whole series of support operations with the Afghan forces. It was exactly the right thing to do, trying to build up their capacity to take on the Taliban itself. But that started to go wrong. It started to go wrong when President Trump was in office the first time round and said, we need to deal with the Taliban. And then it was taken forward by Joe Biden. At that point, the extent of our liability for support and protection of the people we've been working with should have been clear, and we should have known what was going on. We absolutely didn't. If you look what happened in August 21, where we had op pitting, the evacuation, the original plan was to evacuate about 3,000 people. We ended up evacuating some 15,000, and that was only a portion of those for whom we've been working with. And the reality of life is, whatever their name, whether they're under the Afghan Ministry of Interior, Afghan National Forces, whatever the title was, the truth was they were paid, they were mentored, they were trained by us. Effectively, they were, if you like, local auxiliary forces.
Here's the thing. I think there's a big difference between someone's working as a translator for British forces while they're out there, and they are therefore at risk for, basically, working with the enemy, according to the Taliban. But Afghan men and women, I'm assuming mostly men, training and operating in the Afghan army, as much as I would be concerned about anyone's future, I'm more concerned, by the way, about women and girls' future under the Taliban currently in Afghanistan. I'm not entirely sure why we have a duty of care to bring a lot of those people over to the UK, because it was, with all due respect, they're paid, it was their choice, they were doing a job. They were doing a job not for us, they were doing a job for their country.
Well, what they were doing, they're continuing what we've been trying to do, which was actually to maintain that we keep the Taliban out. We'd chosen we'd stopped doing it directly, we're now doing it indirectly, using those. But the reality was they were effectively being trained and organised by us.
So what?
If I may, Julie, if I may. But the other thing that was going on is we knew very clearly, and this is the whole point about the timing issue, we knew from whenever they were captured by the Taliban, they were being murdered. And there is some very grim footage of Afghan commander units trained and mentored by us, handed over to the Taliban, who then murdered, and the Taliban filmed it. And I think that was the point where we realised, actually, we couldn't just leave them. But that must have been clear to us from about April 21. My real beef is, two first. One, we didn't seem to have any idea what the scale of this was. So every organisation, whether it be our special forces, MI6, the Foreign Office, whoever, were organising these separate groups of people under the same rubric, trained, paid for, mentored by us. So creating a huge liability, we didn't see any idea of it. And then from April 21 onwards, it was very clear that the Afghan government was going to struggle to survive. But there was no planning done at that point to get them out. So we've ended up with this kind of crisis. And I understand that the distinctions have been made, but the reality lies, yes, directly employed by us, the locally employed civilians, the Afghan interpreters, and other individuals.
Oh, just cut off and frozen. Hopefully we can get that line back, because it gets interesting to go back over that background. That actually this goes back further. Have we got Simon back? Line's just dropped. So many tech problems over the last few days. Very, very frustrating. And Matthew Larson's still with me. That's very interesting that, this idea that we have a duty of care to all of them. Now, I've always been very strong in the view that we have this duty of care to, the interpreters and people like that. But the idea that everyone who worked in the Afghanistan army while we were there was at risk and we have a duty of care, I struggle with that.
Well, if we have a duty of care, we should still be there. I mean, we shouldn't have pulled out in the absolutely chaotic and frankly disgraceful way that we did. Now, clearly, we couldn't stay without the Americans, and the Americans were determined to get out. Trump and Biden both pursued that, as we've heard. But we have to be realistic about this. We cannot have the entire Afghan army of the entire 20-year period that we were there for.
So where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line? And that's the issue. And I'm glad the government seems to have drawn the line quite tightly now on this list, but we can't just use it as an excuse.
Well, indeed. OK, Simon Diggins, we've got him back, former Defence Attaché to the UK in Kabul. Thank you. I'm so glad we got you back on the line. So, look, you're saying this goes back a long way. When we got to the point, we got a data leak, 19,000 almost names are released in February 2022. The MOD didn't find out about it until 2023. Were they right to issue that super injunction? Because we understand there was a D notice, which basically, for national security reasons, people can't publish. But were they right to get a super injunction, which, by the way, the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace seems, I didn't apply for it. I don't know why that was imposed, but it was in place from August 2023, effectively, all the way until yesterday. Can that be justified on not just whether?
I think what can be justified is the initial super injunction, because clearly there was a crisis. They needed to sort it out. There are national security implications. There are people for whom we had a degree of responsibility. I listened to your correspondent arguing whether we had a full responsibility or not, but I would argue there was responsibility. So I think there was a justification for the super injunction. At the point where it looked like something really major needed to happen, there are ways of communicating where you can maintain a degree of public scrutiny. It's very interesting, for example, that the Commons Intelligence Committee, who do have access to classified material, were not made aware of this. So there are ways in which democratic processes, Privy Council rules, where these democratic processes could have been maintained, a degree of supervision, a degree of scrutiny could have been maintained, as well as looking after the interests of
and that's the thing. There's one thing putting on the front page of the Times newspaper or having a secret court hearing, and there's another thing. There are senior figures, former senior figures in government who make up some of these committees, senior figures who can provide some independent-ish scrutiny, not the same scrutiny as you're going to get from newspapers and others. And again, I accept that there would be a need, once you've had that massive mess up and you find out about this data breach, that you want to have some secrecy for a few months. I don't know how one could justify it for all these years. Do you think a lot of the length of time of the super injunction is more about reputation for the government? And there had been previous leaks, and Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, says he takes responsibility. But the reality is the Defence Secretary is not responsible for someone sending an email and getting information in it. I mean, he's not done it directly. He's not ordered someone to do it, or he can't be responsible for every email someone sends. But actually, is this more about protecting reputations over the last couple of years rather than actually a national security issue?
I think it's also about not having the processes in place to cope with the numbers concerned. I think that was also part of it from there. I mean, I've heard what Sir Ben Wallace has said, and I've got a lot of time for him personally. I think what we need from people like Sir Ben Wallace now is some complete honesty and transparency. What was the decision-making processes they made? Why do they make them? And let's understand those things properly. I know there's also a move ahead to try and identify the individual concerned. I think that's I'm sure he's been identified. I think is fine. And whatever has happened to him has happened to him. But I want to understand.
Well, he still works at the MOD.
Well, he may well do, but as I said, it may be I think there are disciplinary processes in place. I think the danger is we go after a scapegoat and actually miss the systemic issues. And for me, this is a systemic failure.
And we know that this wasn't a one-off data leak. I mean, we've had people reading documents and leaving them at bus stops. And I mean, goodness knows what. There's an abject failure by an awful lot of civil servant staff, certainly, in terms of keeping these sort of national secrets. The big worry a lot of people have is what other super injunctions has the government got? Because interestingly, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, when asked about this, said, "Well, I'm not aware of any. I've not been," we said, read into. But the reality is, if there were super injunctions, he wouldn't be allowed legally to tell us.
No, I mean, I think the whole business about super injunction needs a complete review. In the past, it's been used to hide celebrity gossip, political gossip. It has a kind of civil affairs type element to it. But to be used like this as a kind of blanket suppression of information, to not allow transparency, the look at that you say either it comes from the press or it comes from senior figures who can look at something with scrutiny, I think is wrong. There's always a balance to be taken between national security and if you like, the demands, the imperatives of democracy. And there's always a balance to be judged. But by using a very blunt instrument like the super injunction, that balance has been lost. And we now end up in the situation we're in. where we've got a major scandal on our hands. And you rightly highlighted, Julia, and I totally support you, the role of the sad fate of the women of Afghanistan. One of the real failures of the system was the Home Office was so devoted to trying to make this system work that the scheme which existed to try and bring civil actors, judges, advocates, journalists, even women who'd been halfway through their medical studies who had to stop that was all stopped. That scheme basically died.
But isn't there an issue here? And we want, wouldn't it be great to save every single woman in Afghanistan or every single person? But isn't there an element where, all the people who would have stood up or who could possibly in the future stand up to the Taliban, who could actually fight for a better life in Afghanistan, we bring them all here or bring them all to America, and I'm sure lots have gone to America as well, that, there's no one left to stand up to the government. Shouldn't these people, to a certain extent, stay and fight for their country? I'd like to think I'd do that for my country.
I think we all could hope to do that, but you look at the history of, say, resistance movements in Europe during the Second World War. I mean, some fought, some just cut their head down. But the whole point was the scheme. It's called the ACRS scheme. Was around civil actors. Some 20,000 option places were there. We've used some 12,500. There are still thousands of people out there who believed in what we were offering them. And I know people are very critical about what happened in Afghanistan, but they believed in what we were offering them. They went along with us, and we left. I think wrongly we left, but we did leave, and they have now been let down. And so, for me, there are so many victims of this failure. But one of the ones I would highlight, and you picked up as well, are individuals like that who could have contributed.
Just finally, talking about the money, there's £7 billion total cost was used in court repeatedly. We're now told it's going to be under £1 billion, 800 odd million. Just throw around numbers like that. It's only money after all. And then another billion possibly in legal action. People, some of whom are still in Afghanistan, we haven't got here, whose names were leaked. I mean, this money's just thrown around. Been no public scrutiny of this cost, and of course, a lot of people are saying they're unhappy about the fact that a lot of these people have arrived in this country, and yes, they may well have been vetted, probably better than the men who are getting off the boats. And Afghanistan is among one of the main groups of people getting off those dinghies in the Channel. But there is also a concern about who are these people, and are these people we want in this country? They may be at risk for the Taliban. Doesn't necessarily mean they're not necessarily a risk to people here.
No, and those are legitimate concerns. And again, it's a question of where is our responsibility as a country?
Yeah.
And I think there's no easy answer, and that's on the individual basis. And I think, to be fair, that's one of the reasons why this took a bit of time, is the Home Office was trying to understand who those individuals were. But I said, go right back to the beginning when we were talking. One of the real challenges was we didn't really know who it was that we were training, supporting, and mentoring.
Yeah, but that's a bit of a problem in the first place. Colonel Simon Diggins, great to hear your thoughts. Former defence attaché, former military man himself, Colonel Diggins. Thank you very much indeed.